So, if you haven't been living under a rock, you'll have noticed that I've been slowly putting up Flesh and Blood lore videos on the channel and talking more about that game, its characters, and its lore. This was a conscious decision. While I did initially envision this channel as sort of a hub for all things Magic the Gathering lore, in recent months this outlook has changed, and I've instead decided to focus more on covering lore from whatever I enjoy, and Flesh and Blood has definitely turned into a thing I enjoy. I've been vaguely aware of the game since it came out, and I'd been buying and selling Flesh and Blood cards since late 2020 to early 2021. But despite handling a lot of the cards, I didn't actually play the game itself, nor did I really care to until last year. You see, years of just awful decisions from WotC finally wore me down, and I started looking for other games to play. I had a few options actually. There's a decently large local scene for Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Here, but I opted not to try either again for very different reasons. Pokemon is definitely a fun game, but local tournaments happen exclusively on days I'm not available, so I skipped on that. Yu-Gi-Oh! Meanwhile, I avoided because modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just... It's bad, okay? Now, there is a local Edison format tournament I attend from time to time, but that's kind of different. That's enjoying Yu-Gi-Oh! From like 10 plus years ago. It's different. It's a kind of experience that's very different from modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And I'm not going to dedicate my hobby time to a throwback format. So I started looking at other games. Vanguard I passed on because the core game mechanics just don't appeal to me. Digimon and Force of Will both had promise, and I had and still have several decks for both games, but the local scene was pitiful in terms of attendance for Digimon, and Force of Will in particular seemed like the kind of game that has huge ebbs and flows in the player base. So, that brought me to Flesh and Blood. I had a sizable pile of Flesh and Blood cards after all, and there were tournaments being held regularly just a town or so away, so I figured, why not? Why not give it a try? And so, around June-ish last year, I attended an Uprising pre-release for Flesh and Blood, and ever since then, I've been getting more and more into the game, approaching it with the same kind of fervor I did when I first got into Magic almost 9 years ago now. Of course, recently, as you all know, I've started branching out the channel to cover lore that I enjoy. Flesh and Blood has lore that I enjoy, and so I'm covering it here, but while I may fundamentally understand what I like about this game and its lore, the same isn't necessarily true for you, the viewers. So, in this video, I will attempt to explain what it is exactly that I like so much about Flesh and Blood, the game, as well as Flesh and Blood, the lore. Please keep in mind that I'm very, very bad at articulating what it is I like about things, so what follows may come off as kind of nonsensical, but please bear with me as I try to share what I like about Flesh and Blood, as well as why I want to share it with all of you. With that said, let us begin. The gameplay of Flesh and Blood itself, the meat and bones of the game, revolves around two mechanics: the class system and the resource system. Let's handle the second first. I've always believed that card games with resource systems are better than card games without them. Looking at you, Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, Flesh and Blood has two separate resource systems built into the game. The first is your action points, and the second is your resource points. At the start of your turn, you get an action point, and you use that action point to play a card. Cards that give you Go Again refund your action points, and there's other ways to get action points. Once you're out of action points, your turn is effectively over. You have nothing else you can do besides playing instants, putting a card into your arsenal, and passing the turn. But the other resource system determines, well, what you can play. You see, resource points are used to not cast your spells, but to perform your actions and your attacks. Every card has a cost to it, ranging from 0 to, I think 6 is the highest I've seen. I'm pretty sure I saw a 6 cost at one point. And these resources are generated in an interesting way. You see, every card in the game is two things at once, most of the time. It's both an action or an attack or an item and a resource. Every card can be pitched from your hand to the pitch zone to generate 1 to 3 resources. Many, but not all, cards in the game have 3 different versions of that card, especially at the common level. There will be a red, blue, and yellow version of the card, and the difference between these 3 versions is how much they pitch for as well as how much they attack for. So a red slap you in the face, for instance, can pitch for only 1 resource, but it attacks for 4 damage, maybe, whereas the blue version will pitch for 3 resources and attack for a little less. The yellow, of course, pitches for 2 and is somewhere in the middle. Now, all cards in the game operate on this resource system. They cost resources and they can be pitched for resources. This ensures that you have this kind of weird, balance you have to choose from. Do you want to play this card as an attack or use it to pay for a different attack? It's very interesting to think about, and looking at every single card, you kind of have to balance out how your deck works. It's really interesting to think about. You don't have lands. You know, there are generic cards that operate exclusively as resources, but, for the most part, most of the cards in your deck are going to be spells that are also mana, to look at it from a Magic perspective. It's really interesting to think about, and it's crazy how they designed this game around this kind of resource system. I think it's amazing. But the resource system isn't the only system determining what goes into your deck and how you balance it. There's also the class system. You see, every hero in the game, that is, every commander for you Magic players, has a class or a subclass, and every card that can go into your deck reflects those classes, either by being a generic card that can go into any deck, or by having a class that matches up with a hero. Now, you can only play class cards in the deck of that corresponding hero. So let's say that I've chosen a warrior hero. I've chosen a warrior hero to play with, which means the only cards I can have in that deck are warrior cards and generic cards. It's interesting to think about because this prevents, most of the time, one deck from having all of the best cards. You know, there's a bunch of really great cards that are from different classes that have all kinds of crazy effects, and this class system prevents any one deck from getting all of the best cards in the game. So it really does prevent a best deck scenario. It's really interesting to think about. Now, beyond just that, there's, for the class system itself, there's this weird multi-hero selection system for it. Every class has at least 2 heroes. Mechanologist only has 2 heroes. That'll be another video where I talk about Mechanologist. Most classes have at least 2 heroes. So when you want to build a deck for a specific class, you get to choose between several different heroes to work with. And the reason you might want to pick one hero over another is because every hero in the game has an ability. And these abilities, they can range from very simple to altering the very way you approach the class. Some heroes have abilities that change how you look at the cards you might otherwise put into your deck. Maybe there's cards that are really good for the class, but because of the ability of your hero, you're going to want different cards. It's really neat. It's really interesting to think about. It's an amazing subsystem, and it's part of the weird mechanics of the game. This class system and the resource system, they come together so well to make this game where you're thinking about all kinds of different interactions, all kinds of different rules, all kinds of different methods to pay for your cards. When you're building a deck, there's so much to consider, and it's really, really interesting. It's fascinating to think about. Now, as you know, there's all kinds of things to consider when building a deck for any game, but for Flesh and Blood in particular, there's all kinds of layers to it. What kind of cards do I want to defend with? What kind of cards do I want to attack with? And what kind of cards do I want to play that play well with the hero I've selected? It's really fascinating stuff, and I really love looking at this kind of stuff when evaluating whether or not I like a game. How deep can the mechanics, how deep can the deck building go? And for Flesh and Blood, you can start really easily with a deck. You can build a deck that's very simple to understand, but you can also build a really convoluted deck with all kinds of layers to it, and it's really neat. And that's, I could say that over and over again. It's neat, it's cool, but I think instead I'll just move on. The next thing I want to talk about is the equipment system. You see, at the start of the game, you have this thing called an inventory. It's like a little side deck of equipment cards, and you equip those cards to your hero. You have different slots. You have the weapon, you have the arms, you have the head, you have the chest, and you have the legs. And each piece of equipment does two things. They either A, have an ability, or B, defend for a certain value. And they can interchange ability and defensive value in a bunch of different combinations. Now, just like every other card in the game, each equipment has, it's either a generic equipment or it is a equipment for a specific class. And ostensibly this is to prevent any one class having the best equipment, but unfortunately they put the best equipment, Findel's Spring Tunic, as a generic, so moot point, I suppose. Now, why would you want to select different equipment? Well, it's because a lot of different equipment in the game have different abilities that can help out in different ways depending on your matchup. So you're not just thinking about, hey, does this equipment help my deck and its game plan, but also, does this equipment do good? Does it perform well against the specific type of hero I'm playing against? And that's another just amazing thing to consider when you're building your deck is, hey, is the equipment I'm running in this matchup, is this good for the matchup? It's hard to explain, obviously, without having a bunch of examples up on screen, but different equipment can, for instance, block once and then is destroyed. But that equipment has a really good ability that justifies only being able to defend with it once. Other equipment can defend multiple times and wear down slowly each time, but equally has a useful ability that justifies kind of, being able to block with it only a handful of times before, again, it's gone for good. Other equipment doesn't block for anything, but has an ability that's so good that you just kind of don't care that it can't block for any damage. You're just using it for that ability. It's crazy to think about, and it's just really something interesting to consider when you're building the deck. Again, just another neat layer of deck building that I really like, that I really think is fun when playing these kind of games. And now, after you've selected all the cards for your deck and you've selected the equipment, you get down to the core gameplay. And the core gameplay experience, the gameplay loop, is this really interesting back and forth of attack, defend, make other actions, try to advance your board state, and try to hinder your opponent in any way you can. It does feel very much, I don't know, what's the best way to explain it? It almost feels like a fighting game in a way. You're making attacks at your opponent, working up towards whatever grand plan you've got going on, and your opponent in turn is blocking and attacking back, and you have to block in turn. Now, when you block, you're not just putting your card up and saying, hey, I'm defending with this. No, when you block, you lose that card you're blocking with. You discard that card from your hand to negate damage from an opponent's attack. That card doesn't necessarily block all of it, by the way. Every card in Flesh and Blood has piercing, to put it in Yu-Gi-Oh terms, where if you don't block all of it, you still get some damage going to you. And you have to choose carefully what you're going to block with, because you can waste that defense points. Your opponent attacks you with only 2 damage, you kind of have to choose, hey, do I block this? I only have a 3 defense card in my hand. Do I want to use this card that could otherwise be an attack to block something that's only doing 2 damage, or do I think there's something else going on here where I might want to block this attack with this overblocked thing? There's all kinds of things to consider. It's really interesting, and it creates this really nice back and forth gameplay loop where you're attacking and you're trying to deplete your opponent's resources, and your opponent is attacking back and trying to deplete your resources. Now, what do I mean when I say resources here? I'm talking about your hand. You see, unlike other card games where you would draw at the start of your turn, in Flesh and Blood, you draw up to your maximum hand size at the end of your turn. So, if an opponent attacks you a lot, many times, like 6 times in one turn, and you're threatened with a lot of damage, you have to block all those attacks, suddenly your hand is empty, and when it comes to your turn, you can't do anything on your turn except wait, pass your turn, draw up to full, and then hope your opponent's follow-up turn isn't just as brutal. And of course, in turn, you have the opportunity to do the same thing to your opponent. You can attack a bunch of times in your turn and try to get them to empty their hand, blocking what you've got going, which does 2 things. A, it threatens them with a lot of damage, and B, it removes a lot of their counterattack options. It's really neat. It's a really tight, efficient gameplay loop, which makes Flesh and Blood feel like, on some level, it feels kind of like a fighting game. Or to put it in video game terms, it kind of feels like the gameplay you get in Dark Souls PvP, where you're kind of constantly trying to wear your opponent down and erode their stamina. And I just realized I made a Dark Souls comparison. So, Flesh and Blood is the Dark Souls of TCGs. Oh god, Free Magic's right, I really am a game journalist. Now, beyond the gameplay, the core gameplay, the mechanics of the game, all that jazz, the game's fun because the community is fun. When I first got into Magic, the community wasn't the best. Even back then, the kind of stereotype of the toxic MTG player has stuck with me for a while because it's been kind of true. You go to an LGS and chances are the Magic players there are kind of assholes. That's not been my experience universally, obviously. I have gone to several LGSs where I pop in and say hi to the Magic scene, and they're great people, but on average, I've gone to more LGSs filled with dickbags than I have gone to LGSs with just swell, upstanding guys. That has not been, so far, the case with Flesh and Blood. Every single time I've gone to a new store, every single time I've sat down at a new tournament scene, the Flesh and Blood community has been very welcoming, very open, very friendly, and that's just something really interesting. That's just, obviously that has nothing to do with the gameplay itself. It has nothing to do with how the game is played or your gaming experience, especially if you detach yourself from the community, but it is something to consider that the community itself is just very welcoming, very open, and very fun to be in. Now, obviously there's exceptions to every rule. When I go to big tournaments, obviously, at the Calling Indianapolis, I had an absolutely miserable time, not because of the players necessarily, but because the judges there were just absolute assholes. They were just some of the scummiest people I've ever interacted with. The players are still great, but the Flesh and Blood judge community probably needs some work. It's just something to think about, something interesting to think about when, you can have an absolutely awful experience at this big event, but because the game itself is so fun and because your typical interactions with the community are so great, you still want to play despite your bad experience. It's just something nice to think about. Now, something I want to point out, I've had an interaction recently with someone online who suggested that the only reason I like Flesh and Blood as a game is because I'm really good at it. Now, that person I was talking with didn't get to see me play at all. I want to stress this right here and now. I want to emphasize this. I'm very bad at Flesh and Blood. I'm bad at this game. I'm worse at Flesh and Blood than I am at Magic, and for those of you who don't know, I'm very bad at Magic the Gathering. I'm awful at TCGs. I'm a guy who's not very good at playing the games he enjoys. So no, it's not a case of I like this game because I'm good at the game. I like this game despite the fact that I'm very, very bad at the game. It's just that good. It's just that enjoyable that despite being bad, despite consistently having poor tournament results, I can still just have fun, enjoy things with the community. But, I realized now that I've been rambling on and on about the game, the community, all the fun I've been having. I haven't been talking about the lore. Let's talk about the lore for a bit. The lore of Flesh and Blood. And the first thing you have to understand about the lore of Flesh and Blood is it's short. but very sweet. Flesh and Blood's lore feels like it's been designed for an explorer. The world of Wraith is a very interesting setting. It's very much a typical kitchen sink. You know, it's a very generic looking fantasy world with a lot of different kind of setting tropes thrown into it. There's the future world, there's the Holy Land, there's the Wild Lands, all that jazz. But once you peer past all the generic outlook of it, you see that Wraith is this world that's been designed with a lot of care from the developers. There's all kinds of things to explore. There's all kinds of creatures roaming this land, and you, as a viewer of the world, can't help but look and go, man, what's out here for me to discover? What's out here for me to explore and look at? And there's all kinds of crazy things going on, not just in the card art and the flavor text, but in the descriptions we get for the world, for Aria, for Volcor. There's all kinds of crazy nonsense going on, and there's a lot of deep lore, it looks like. You know, obviously we haven't gotten to any of the big story developments yet. We're very much currently in a period where the Flesh and Blood lore is moving kind of slow, and we're getting kind of tidbits of stuff going on here and there, but everything so far in the lore seems A, connected, and B, moving towards something, and C, it seems like there's something underneath the surface. It feels like there's something going on behind the scenes that, you know, not just characters doing things behind the scenes, but events happening in the past. In the distant past, there's all kinds of notions of these ancient, powerful entities doing something. And there's this notion that the world itself has all kinds of stuff going on. And it's just really something interesting to think about. You know, when you look at the world of Wraith, what are you looking at? You're looking at this interesting fantasy setting where there's a lot of stuff going on at once, and you as the player are only getting a little tidbit of it, but with that tidbit, you're enticed to look for more, and I've been enticed to look for more. There's all kinds of things to consider when examining Flesh and Blood's lore and looking at the world of Wraith. Now, just like in the gameplay section of this video, we have to talk about the heroes of Flesh and Blood, the heroes of Wraith, because each of them is a very interesting character. Some are more interesting than others. Looking at you, Date It All, please get lore, please get it soon. But it's interesting to note that all of the heroes of Flesh and Blood have lore to them. It's not like Magic the Gathering, where 99% of the legendary creatures have absolutely nothing going for them in terms of lore. No, every single Flesh and Blood hero, for the most part, has at least something that you're working with. They either have at least, you know, they at least have a blurb on the website talking about who they are, what they're after, if they don't appear in a story otherwise. Because a lot of them do appear in stories. A lot of them have an effect on the plot of the game. Arachne in particular has a huge effect on the plot of the game. That dude killed the Emperor, another character. As an aside, does anybody else think it's fucking hilarious that the Emperor is introduced as a playable character in the same game, in the same expansion where he's killed? I personally found that to be hilarious. Moving on. You know, I have to express over and over again that the lore does feel very vibrant. It feels very alive. The story is moving in a very interesting way, obviously, and it's moving towards what feels like a goal. Now, with that said, I have to let you guys know, I don't think the Flesh and Blood story is the best story ever. I don't think it's the greatest TCG story. Most Flesh and Blood, like, story installments, most chapters, short stories, they're very short. That's what I said when I said they're very short. You know, they're short, but they're enjoyable. They're very fun to read. They're very fun to look at. They either A, concisely explain what's going on with a hero at any given time, or B, give you a deeper look into the lore of the world itself. And they've all been very enjoyable. Outsiders in particular has had a lot of fun little moments. You know, you have the Arachne backstory where it explains where he came from, how he ended up at the asylum, and then later on how he escaped the asylum and how he eventually teamed up with Uzuri. And this was this very long, very well-read story. And then you have Riptide's story, also from Outsiders, and it's just Riptide rides a boat out somewhere and then shoots a guy, and that's it. It's great. It's very fun. It's very good fun. The Flesh and Blood story is not this big epic fantasy adventure, but it is very enjoyable. Far more enjoyable than Magic's story has been. Far more in several different ways. It's far more, I don't know, concise, consistent. It's been consistently fun. That's the word. It's been consistently fun the entire time I've been reading it, whereas Magic's story has been consistently bad. And I suppose that brings us to the next point of the video, the next reason I like Flesh and Blood so much. And that reason is WotC. Oh, fuck. Wizards of the Coast, for 3, maybe 4 years now, since 2019. So, yeah, almost 4 years now. Wizards of the Coast has done an absolute dog shit job of handling the Magic the Gathering lore. It's been absolutely awful. If you ignore everything else about WotC, if you ignore their terrible gameplay designs, if you ignore companions, if you ignore universes beyond, if you ignore all the bans that happened between 2019 and 2021, if you ignore all the terrible business decisions they've made with, Magic 30 and calling the fucking Pinkertons on a guy, if you ignore all of that, I personally cannot ignore the fact that Magic the Gathering's lore has gotten to an absolute low point. And it's gotten to the point where, again, it reflected so badly on me that it affected me in a way. Sorry, gotta calm down there. It caused me to just give up on it. I have given up on Magic the Gathering's lore because it's gotten to a point where I have absolutely no faith that Wizards of the Coast will improve it. Phyrexia All Will Be One was absolute dog shit. March of the Machines was so bad that I stopped reading the story about halfway through. I have no faith in Magic the Gathering, and that really heavily affected my decision to look at Flesh and Blood's lore. And when you look at Flesh and Blood's lore, and you compare it to what we've gotten, especially from Magic the Gathering's lore, the difference is night and day. It's insane to think about. Like, man, I could have been reading Flesh and Blood lore this entire time instead of wasting it reading Magic the Gathering stories. I got kind of upset for a bit, I could have been doing something completely enjoyable with my time instead of been wasting it being pissed at whatever crazy nonsense Wizards shits out. Not to praise LSS so much, because again, I don't think Flesh and Blood's lore is the best lore. I have to emphasize that. I don't think Flesh and Blood has the best game lore ever. I just think it's so much more fucking enjoyable than Magic the Gathering that I'm actually fucking upset at having wasted my time reading Magic the Gathering lore. Dial it back a bit. Calm down. That's really all I have to say. I like Flesh and Blood the game because the gameplay is fun. It's enjoyable, it's very tight, and there's so many layers to take into consideration when you're building your deck that it's really fun. It feels like deck building is itself a puzzle. It's great. And I like the Flesh and Blood lore because it's very enjoyable. It's very fun lore. The writers are clearly having a good time when they, decide what their characters are doing. It's very consistent, and there's so much to explore. The world of Wraith, it really is this enjoyable open world where you feel like there's a lot going on, and it really does feel like there's more to the story than just what's being presented to you. So there's all kinds of fun stuff going on, and I just can't help but enjoy it. And that's why I'm going to continue to enjoy it, and I'm going to continue to cover it on the channel and share it with all of you, and hope that you, the viewers, enjoy it in turn. Obviously, all I can hope for is that you guys like the content I put out. I can't demand it. I mean, maybe I can. Maybe I'll get to that point where I'm just like, you must like my videos. That'd be interesting. That'd be a cool power to have, forcing people to like your content. Anywho, that's really all I've got for today. Thank you so very much for listening to another unhinged ramble from the Lore Seeker. I hope very much that you've enjoyed, and I hope that in some way I've managed to convey why it is I like this game. Thanks so much for watching. I hope very much that you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Video's over. Go away.